A child before closed doors, an artist in search of meaning, and an unexpected encounter beneath New York snow. Between rejection and hope, art reveals its true power, to open paths where no one believed they could exist. Snow fell slowly over New York that evening, covering the steps of the imposing Metropolitan Museum of Art. Luxury cars lined up at the entrance. Ladies in sparkling gowns and men in tuxedos walked up the illuminated stairs. The atmosphere exuded wealth, prestige, and exclusivity. Among the elegant crowd stood Amelia Brown, a 10-year-old girl. Her coat was worn, her shoes a little too big, but her eyes glowed with a dream. To see with her own eyes the paintings she admired so much in library books and in the stories from Sunday school. She clutched her old sketchbook tightly against her chest, as if it were a treasure. When she tried to climb the stairs, a corpulent security guard blocked her way. "You can't go in," he said firmly. "But I just wanted to see the paintings," Amelia replied softly. He looked her up and down and laughed with disdain. "This place isn't for poor kids. Go draw on the street, that's all you're good for." The laughter of a few guests cut deeper than the icy wind. Amelia felt her cheeks burn, but she didn't cry. She stepped down, sat on the cold sidewalk, and opened her sketchbook. Her pencil moved nervously over the paper, the majestic columns of the museum, the guests' shining gowns, and at the center, a large closed door before a tiny girl. At the top of the page, she drew a beam of light piercing the clouds, hope in the midst of rejection. Amelia had been drawing since she could hold a pencil. Her mother, Diana Brown, a hard-working cleaning lady who raised her alone, had noticed her daughter's gift early on. Despite their modest means, Diana had sacrificed to buy Amelia's first sketchbook on her 6th birthday. She'd whispered as she handed over the gift, "God gives special talents to special people. Don't ever let anyone dim your light, baby." Those words echoed in Amelia's mind now as she continued sketching, her fingers growing numb in the cold. The rejection stung, but it wasn't new. At school, the other children often mocked her second-hand clothes and her constant drawing. But when she drew, the world's sharp edges softened. In her art, she created spaces where she belonged. She added more details to her drawing. The shadows cast by the museum's grand pillars, the sparkle of distant chandeliers visible through the windows, and in the corner, almost hidden, a small country church with an empty wooden pew by the window. The church where she and her mother attended services every Sunday, where she would sketch during the sermon, trying to capture the way the light filtered through the stained glass. Inside the museum, Edward Mason, the great painter of the night, smiled for authorities and photographers. He was celebrated, yet empty. His recent works were beautiful but lifeless, lacking the spark that once moved him. Exhausted, he slipped out through a side door. At 52, Edward had achieved everything he'd ever dreamed of professionally. His paintings hung in prestigious galleries around the world. Critics praised his masterful technique, his signature use of light against darkness. But lately, his brush moved without passion. The paintings sold, but they felt hollow, like echoes of his earlier work rather than new expressions. Edward's thoughts drifted to his childhood in a small rural town. His mother, a devout woman with calloused hands from years of factory work, had scrimped and saved to buy him his first set of paints after seeing his talent. Despite having little formal education herself, she had believed in his gift with unwavering faith. "Remember where your talent comes from," she'd often say. "It's not just for fame or money. It's to show others the beauty they might miss." Those words had guided him through art school and his early struggling years. When had he forgotten them? When had painting become about galas and price tags rather than truth and light? The weight of these thoughts made the air in the museum feel stifling. Excusing himself from a conversation with a wealthy patron, Edward slipped away, needing a moment of quiet. That's when he saw Amelia. The little girl kneeling in the snow drew with the intensity of someone praying silently to God. Intrigued, Edward approached. "What are you drawing, little one?" She tried to cover her sketchbook. "Just what I feel." When he gently insisted, Amelia showed him the page. Edward froze. The drawing was more than skill, it was truth. The closed door, the girl's loneliness, the divine light cutting through the clouds. And in the corner, almost hidden, Amelia had sketched a small church with an empty pew. Edward's breath caught. It was identical to the little church of his childhood, where he used to draw while his mother prayed. With a trembling voice he asked, "Who taught you to draw like this?" "My mother says God gave me this gift, but sometimes I think nobody believes it." Edward shivered. It wasn't just talent, it was a calling. "May I see more of your drawings?" he asked, kneeling beside her despite the snow seeping through his expensive trousers. Hesitantly, Amelia turned the pages of her sketchbook. There were drawings of her mother sleeping in an armchair after a long day's work, the lines around her eyes captured with such tenderness. A sparrow perched on a fire escape, an old man feeding pigeons in the park, his loneliness and dignity rendered with surprising insight. Each drawing told a story, revealed a truth. "How old are you, Amelia?" 10, she answered, surprised he'd asked her name. "I was 11 when I sold my first drawing," Edward said softly. "A neighbor paid me $5 for a sketch of his dog." He smiled at the memory. "Do you know who I am?" She shook her head. "My name is Edward Mason." Amelia's eyes widened. "The painter, the one with the night paintings with all the light shining through," Edward nodded, touched that this child knew his work. "Your Midnight Cathedral is in my library book," she said with growing excitement. "I've copied it 7 times, trying to understand how you made the moonlight look like that." Edward felt a lump in his throat. When was the last time he'd spoken to someone who cared about the light in his paintings rather than their price tag? "Why are you sitting out here in the cold?" he asked, though he'd overheard enough to guess. Amelia's excitement dimmed. "They said I can't go in. It's okay, I understand." "No," Edward said firmly, "it's not okay, and you shouldn't understand." He stood up, brushing snow from his knees, and held out his hand. "Come with me." In the main hall, the microphone announced his name, but Edward didn't walk in alone. He held Amelia's hand. "Come with me," she hesitated. "I can't, they said I wasn't allowed to enter." "Then tonight we will show them they were wrong." The room froze. Murmurs spread as the great artist entered, a poor little girl by his side. The same guard who had rejected her stepped back, speechless. Edward took the microphone. "Tonight isn't about my paintings. It's about something I had forgotten and that this girl reminded me of." He held up Amelia's sketch for all to see. The hall fell silent. The image of the closed door and the light breaking through the clouds struck every heart. And when Edward recognized the tiny church, he could no longer hold back his tears. God uses the small to remind the great of what truly matters. Applause erupted, first timid, then a standing ovation. Amelia, once humiliated, was now honored before them all. "This young artist," Edward continued when the applause subsided, "was told she didn't belong here. That art wasn't for her." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of donors, critics, and fellow artists. "But art belongs to everyone. Beauty speaks to all hearts willing to listen. I've spent years painting, but today, this child reminded me why I began in the first place." As Edward spoke, Amelia stood beside him, hardly believing what was happening. She thought of her mother, who would be finishing her evening shift at the hospital cafeteria, who had never stopped believing in her daughter's gift, even when they couldn't afford proper art supplies. 20 years ago," Edward continued, "I was discovered by a renowned artist who saw my work in a small gallery. He mentored me, opened doors for me. Today, I want to do the same for Amelia Brown." The crowd murmured in approval. The museum director approached, clearly flustered, casting a disapproving glance at the security guard who had turned Amelia away. "Mr. Mason, perhaps we could arrange a special tour for the young lady, and maybe discuss a youth outreach program." Edward nodded but kept his focus on Amelia. "Would you like to see the paintings now?" Her eyes shining, Amelia nodded. What followed was a dream come true. Edward guided Amelia through the galleries, explaining techniques and sharing stories behind famous works. He was struck by her questions, not about fame or fortune, but about how the artists captured certain feelings, how they mixed their colors, why they made specific choices. Near the end of the tour, they stopped before one of Edward's own paintings, a nocturnal scene of a small town with a church steeple silhouetted against a star-filled sky. "This reminds me of my church," Amelia said softly. "It's the church from my hometown," Edward replied, "where I used to sit and draw during sermons." "My mother says I shouldn't draw during church," Amelia confessed, "but sometimes I can't help it. It's like the feeling of the place has to come out through my pencil." Edward smiled. "I understand exactly what you mean." As the evening wound down, Edward realized he had to face a practical concern. "Amelia, your mother must be worried about you. Do you have a way to contact her?" Amelia's face fell. "My mom works late at the hospital cafeteria. She gave me money for the bus to come see the museum from outside. I was supposed to just look at the building and be home by 8. She glanced at the clock on the wall. She'll be scared if I'm not there." Edward immediately arranged for his driver to take them to Amelia's home, a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood. Diana Brown opened the door, her face tight with worry that transformed into shock when she saw her daughter accompanied by a man in an expensive suit. "Mama," Amelia rushed forward. "This is Mr. Mason. He's a famous painter, and he let me into the museum, and everyone saw my drawings." Diana Brown looked bewildered, exhaustion evident in the lines of her face. She was still wearing her cafeteria uniform, her hands red from hours of work and hot water. "I'm so sorry if she was bothering you, sir," Diana began, misunderstanding the situation. "No, Mrs. Brown," Edward said quickly. "Your daughter wasn't bothering anyone. In fact, she taught me something important tonight." He explained what had happened, watching Diana's expression shift from concern to pride as she understood the significance of the evening. "Amelia has remarkable talent," Edward said. "With your permission, I'd like to mentor her. There's a Saturday art program at the museum for gifted children. It's usually quite competitive to get in, but I sit on the board and I can guarantee her a place." Diana's eyes filled with tears. "We couldn't afford." "It would be fully funded," Edward assured her, "including all supplies." Diana looked at her daughter, who was practically vibrating with excitement. "God does work in mysterious ways," Diana said softly. 1 year later, Edward stood in the museum's youth gallery, watching visitors admire the exhibition of student work. At the center hung Amelia's newest piece, a large canvas depicting a young girl walking through an open door into a room filled with light, surrounded by encouraging faces. Edward's own work had transformed over the past year. Critics noted a return of the passion and purpose that had marked his early career. His latest series, Doorways, explored themes of access, opportunity, and divine light breaking through human barriers. Every Saturday, rain or shine, he worked with Amelia and the other students in the expanded youth program, now open to children from all backgrounds. The security guard who had once turned Amelia away had been reassigned after sensitivity training and now enthusiastically welcomed visitors to the new Art for All community exhibitions. Diana Brown stood beside Edward, watching her daughter explain her painting technique to an impressed museum patron. "She's blossoming," Diana said softly. "She is," Edward agreed. "But she already had the gift. She just needed someone to open the door." "Sometimes," Diana replied, "the teacher becomes the student." Edward nodded, thinking of how a 10-year-old girl's drawing in the snow had rekindled his own divine spark. "And sometimes," he said, "God sends exactly the teacher we need."